Hello, everyone. My name is Lou Frederick. I'm a state representative here. I'm from North and Northeast Portland, and I am really glad to see all of you here. I can't begin to tell you how happy I am to see as many folks involved in this as we possibly can. If you were listening to Marketplace this morning on NPR, they were talking about this very issue, this concern. And so I felt a little bit, this is going to, for a few people, they will not recognize the reference, but we missed it by that much. A little Maxwell Smart. For some folks. We've been talking about this, a lot of us, for some time, and I think I'm really pleased with the report that Peter's put together, OEIB has put together, and some of the references, the 32 articles that you had, and by the time you presented that, there were at least 12 more that I know of that have come out regarding this particular issue. So this is a concern, and we're going to get started. I know that Sherry Springer is on her way, and Lori Wimmer are both also on their way here. I'm not sure was Chuck here? I thought I saw Chuck.
He's here, so he'll be right.
Okay, he's back in.
Thank
Okay,
you.
that's good. We'll get started a bit, and Peter, why don't you give us a sense of the agenda here?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Representative Frederick, and I concur. It's great to have so many folks in the audience and online and willing to be part of the work group. The first item of the agenda is introductions, and I'm going to do the introduction first. And it might be longer than other folks' introduction because I'd like to put a couple of things on the table out there as a co-convener of the committee, and then hopefully not say a whole lot afterwards. We've got a number of OEIB staff here who are going to be taking notes and recording what's said so that we can give the best service to the work group as possible to collect the information and move forward. Personally, my background is much more as a practitioner in the K-12 sector. I'm fairly new to state government, so I feel like what I personally can bring is a lot of information about what it's like to be in a school as a teacher or a principal or work in the district office, much less so what it's like to write legislation or to work on public policy. I'm learning that, and I'm really hoping that the mentors that sit on this committee who've done a lot more of that kind of work help fill in that gap in terms of my expertise and our expertise. Just for some context, my first knowledge about statewide longitudinal data systems that OEIB is working on was an OPB interview that was back in 2011. Might have been beginning of 2012. And I was randomly called by OPB to ask my opinion as someone who worked in schools about whether or not the OEIB, and I actually didn't exactly know I worked in schools, didn't really know what the OEIB was, whether that group should hold confidential personal student information for the purpose of improving statewide outcomes. And I'm very vocal, and if you Google the article, you can see really, really vocal that I saw no reason whatsoever that a new statewide umbrella agency should have that kind of information. And I'm actually quoted in the article as being sort of the opposing point of view about this database. And ironically enough, about a year later, when Nancy Golden, who's a colleague of mine who I've worked with for 18 years, ascended to the job of chief state school officer, she actually asked that I leave the district where I worked and come up to the OEIB to do that exact thing, work on the statewide longitudinal database. And one of the reasons that Dr. Golden chose me to do that, I think, was because my point of view at that point and today is that there is no reason for a statewide organization like the OEIB to hold personally identifiable information or to share it in any way. Most of the stuff that we at OEIB want to do in terms of outcomes and investments, or all of it really, can be done without any student information, personally identifiable student information. And this is a topic that's going to come up in some detail as the committee moves forward, is when is it acceptable to use student data and under what conditions is it acceptable. But I just want to put out there that even though my position at OEIB, and I've argued a business case before the legislature and before Representative Frederick about student data might lead you to believe that I have one opinion or OEIB has one opinion about student data. It's not that simple, not that clear. I also want to let folks know just some personal experience. When you're in a school, the topic of student data is very, very complex. Student data is used in the classroom effectively by teachers. It's used effectively at the building level by principals and teacher groups to make decisions about instruction. It's used at the district level to do all kinds of things. And eventually it's used at the Oregon Department of Education. And if you walk into a school office and your eye is peeled to look at data use, it's dizzying to see how much personal information is exchanged in any given period of time. Kids come up to the counter and say stuff out loud in front of parent volunteers, other staff members, and other students that they probably shouldn't be sharing out loud. Stuff gets written down on pieces of paper because it's really, really busy that maybe shouldn't be written down or should be immediately filed away or locked up. Information is shared between staff members, often inappropriately, but sometimes maybe in a fashion that's not following all the rules. And one thing I see as a principal all the time, and when I visited my kids' classrooms, is things like students' performance up on the wall with their name and how they're doing in a class. That's an old practice that maybe when we went to school all of us were accustomed with, that's completely against the law in terms of sharing a student record. But if you talk to the teacher or the school about that, they look back at you and say, well, how can I do some of this work without some of these tools to have kids know what their progress is? So it's very, very complicated. And I think it's important as we work forward on legislative concepts and policy proposals that we bring in the rich and confusing reality, the day-to-day reality of schools, community colleges, and universities around the maintenance of this information, because it's quite complex. And I think as we'll hear and as we talk back and forth about some of this, it's a lot of the answers that some of us might think are pretty simple turn out to be nuanced and requires a nuanced set of policy proposals to really make them work on the ground. A couple other things I just want to mention. While I was a principal, I worked at the Quality Education Commission as a commissioner. And the Quality Education Commission and ODE has a representative on that, Brian Reeder. Members of his staff are in the audience right now. The Quality Ed Commission is one example of a group that uses student data to forward better outcomes in Oregon in an anonymous fashion. And I just want to share one of their great realizations from the Quality Ed Commission and from Brian Reeder at ODE, just to give you one example of why you'd ever need this kind of information. It turns out, and this is a big topic in Oregon about improving outcomes for students, particularly historically underserved students. And one particular population that we're working to improve, all of us, is the performance of students for whom English is not their first language. And at ODE, you can look at averages, you can look at groups of students in the aggregate, and you can see certain stories about ELL students, English language learner students, and their outcomes. One thing that they could see at the Quality Ed Commission, based on anonymous information through the Oregon Department of Education, is a really interesting fact that I didn't know, even though I've worked in schools for years. And that fact is that in Oregon, if you're identified as an English language learner and graduate out of the ELL program before you enter high school, you graduate high school at a higher level than native English speakers, white native English speakers. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because bilingualism is a really great thing. And obviously, if you're bilingual, research shows that you're probably more able to do all kinds of different things, and it bears out in Oregon that those students graduate at a higher rate. The only way to actually show that was true was to have a longitudinal record. Again, it's anonymous. We don't know who these students are, but Brian and ODE was able to follow individual students through their pathways. And by sorting when they actually left the ELL program, could look at outcomes. Very, very powerful, very, very significant in terms of where we spend our money. done, I think, appropriately because it was all anonymous, and yet it may be something that people have questions about. So I just wanted to share that as something that I've seen, because although I haven't been up in the state government at the OEIB, I have personally worked at the Quality Ed Commission, and that was something that's interesting. Last thing I want to share in terms of background that I think is relevant, because if you're wondering anything about me personally, and if you read our report, you'll see that, as far as I can see, the largest documented data breach of Social Security numbers in our state, at least that we can find in our analysis, happened in the school district where I worked. And I actually took the job as technology director in the Eugene School District about 2 months after the data breach occurred. In that data breach, 16,000 student records that contained the Social Security numbers of kids in our district, including 2 of my children, were gotten to by a student in our district. This is a student I ended up interviewing to find out what the heck happened. And just like cancer, the only way you can get cancer is to have a series of failures in your body that allows a cancer to grow. What happened in Eugene was a series of failures that, with hindsight, probably could have been eliminated, but what happened was a series of breakdowns in the system. And I don't need to go into a lot of detail, but it's suffice to say there were mistakes made in a variety of places in the system that a very enterprising, clever 16-year-old kid with time on his hands penetrated. And thank God, or thank whatever, what he did with those 16,000 confidential records was post them on Google Docs, not share them with anybody but our superintendent, and basically sent a message and said, look what I did. You've got a problem in your district, you better fix it. He still got in trouble, right? But that's great information. But there's no guarantee that same circumstance couldn't have ended really differently. People pay money for Social Security numbers, and that could have gone differently. And what I found coming into that position in Eugene was the policies that we were governed under, whether they're legal policies from the state or district policies, were insufficient to corral or to contain or to address modern security issues. They were written at a time where there was not organizations that would pay for Social Security numbers. They were written at a time where network data systems were not as tied together as they were when the policies were written. And they were written at a time where people just couldn't conceive of the ubiquitous nature of logins and connected systems that are common today. And in Eugene, what we really felt at that time was, boy, we wish we had more guidance and maybe even better and stronger laws that we would have to follow because we were starting from scratch. And I don't doubt that that's a similar condition in many school districts across the country, certainly in Oregon, that the practices and policies that exist were created at a time where we couldn't conceive of or really understand all the threats that are out there. Just a little bit of background. It was a lot of egg on the face of the district. It was front page news in the Register Guard, which is our local paper. And to this day, the district is still responding with issues like accountability for the people involved, policies throughout the different departments, practices in the schools, and the like, and audits. How do we audit ourselves to make sure that we're actually conforming to the laws that are on the books? What I want to say about this group is that what I understand our work is supposed to be, and I said to Representative Frederick right before we started this meeting that I hope to get guidance from people who know a lot more about this than I do, is that our role would be to produce some policy recommendations or some type of report from this group that may not be unanimous as we go through the different issues. We have a diversity of points of view here, and I'm hopeful that on some of the issues we're going to get consensus, and I'm expecting that on other issues we won't. And it's not the job of this group to write legislation, although we may be asked to draft legislation, sample legislation to consider. We might and can today produce legislation from other states that we could consider. And we put at the end of the agenda, we're also really interested in hearing as many other perspectives as there are out there so that we can surface the issues and sharpen the debate so it's really, really clear as we move into the session what's up. And it may be that we don't produce a win at the end of all this. I'm very hopeful for the kids of Oregon, the districts of Oregon, community colleges and universities that we can give better direction because I think it's a crisis. And I think we're going to hear more from Rep. Frederick in just a couple of minutes about that. But we're really hopeful that we can reach some consensus around huge issues. And so what I'd like to do now is ask the group one by one to introduce themselves. I don't expect as long an introduction at all, but like I said, I want to kick things off and set some kind of context as a co-convener and then not talk a whole lot afterwards. But what I would like members of the work group to say is who you are, who you represent, if possible, a little bit about why you're here. And if you have hopes and fears that you'll share, best hopes and worst fears, that's really, really helpful as a convener to just get a sense of what people are looking for and what they're concerned about. And we can start, I don't know if maybe we can start at the end down there and then go around. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, my name is Mario Parker Milligan. I'm the Legislative Director for the Oregon Student Association. We represent over 120,000 public university and community college students. And I'm here because we care about our data and privacy.
Okay, my name is Ben Tate. I'm the Chief Information Officer for the Oregon Department of Education. And I am here because my department maintains and all of the data systems which store the records from the districts in a variety of data collections. So I'll clarify and say we don't store all of the data. There's certain data points that we collect throughout the school year and then usually provide those in aggregate form either to the state or to the federal government. All of our data collections are based on a mandate either from the federal government or from the state. We do not collect at this point any data that is not required from one of those entities. As far as hopes and fears, I think I'll echo Peter in saying that this is a conversation that's long overdue. Before I came here, I was with Salem-Keizer Public Schools, so I have some experience in terms of the struggles that happen at the local level. And I think Peter is absolutely right that guidance is absolutely necessary for our districts in terms of navigating these waters. Eugene and Salem-Keizer have a leg up because they're bigger, they've got some resources. There's a lot of very small school districts that are really kind of drowning. They're trying to do everything they can to teach the students, and matters like this, while very, very important, is very difficult for them to wrap their heads around without some more direct guidance from folks. So I think this is a very, very important conversation. The thing that you will probably hear me bring up is these data submissions are tied to a lot of things in terms of federal funding, state funding. So there are additional issues. And unfortunately, it's not one of those things where we can just say, well, let's just cut this collection. So we have to explore the impacts. I do think it is absolutely necessary that we review all of these collections. Some of them have been in practice for a while, and we should review if the original need behind them is still there or not. But I also will be bringing up the impacts, for each of these data points and what happens if we adjust them in any way.
And Ben, can you explain why you'll be leaving at 10?
Oh yes, sorry, I got focused on that. So I am going to have to leave at 10. My wife had our second child 2 days ago. Thank you. By C-section, so we're getting discharged from the hospital today, so I'm going to be leaving to kind of help her get home. So don't be offended if I leave.
Good morning, I am Cinnamon Alden. I'm with the Enterprise Security Office, which I am representing the state's Chief Information Security Officer. We are charged by statute to ensure the information security for state government. We focus mostly on setting policies and standards and doing a lot of the proactive work, as much as we are also the reactive as well. If there's an incident or a breach of information, we are charged with coordinating that and responding and doing all of the really non-glorious tasks that end up on the front page. Hopefully, most do not. So we really are happy to be here. We work with state agencies. We also work with local government and federal government, Homeland Security. And we appreciate we tend to work in silos within our own environments. Even within agencies, we have our own program silos. So getting the opportunity to talk to a wide group and understanding what the impacts are. I appreciate Ben's comment about reviewing processes. So my main focus is business process. And we tend to be doing things because that's the way we've done them. So reviewing why we're doing it and if that's the right move and how we can do it better. So I'm really hopeful that this group will come forward with some good recommendations, things that not only the state can do, but locals and citizens. I have children, so I'm always concerned about their privacy in school and question things that go on in our own schools and just trying to make it better. So thank you for having me.
Becky Strauss, I'm with the ACLU of Oregon. I am here in the interest of ensuring the privacy rights of students in Oregon. Essentially, and I really am not coming in with any preconceived ideas about what legislation would look like, but kind of look at a broad range of policy issues with the same kind of lens. What are we collecting? Who has access to it? What do we know about what's being collected? What do students and parents know about what's being collected? And having control over that data that is collected and having the ability to correct anything that's incorrect. All of those things kind of come to bear on all of these privacy issues that I work on. And a general mindset or hope that data that's collected for one purpose is not used for another purpose without certain processes or safeguards or permission or consent, things like that. At the same time, in this discussion in particular, there's a little bit of I'm not sure if it's a competing interest, but it's certainly another consideration. ACLU sits on a group, we're not quite a coalition, called the Oregon Alliance for Education Equity, and it's hit home for me really the importance, what Peter started to talk about, the importance of data collection, kind of the flip side. And so obviously for things like eliminating the minority achievement gap and really having access to aggregate, de-identified data that can help us understand those trends and figure out where our education system can improve is really important. The ACLU several years ago now was part of an effort to encourage the Department of Education to make discipline data more accessible. So the Department of Ed now posts district by district discipline data on the website, and we found that to be very useful. We write a not quite annual school to prison pipeline report looking at school discipline data. So again, another example of why this stuff is important and some of the considerations that I'm bringing to bear at this work group.
I'm Chuck Bennett. I'm Director of Government Relations for the Confederation of Oregon School Administrators. We represent the administrators in the 197 school districts and 20 ESDs. There's been, over the past decades, a real explosion in a best practices use of data collection, data use in terms of its facility in designing education strategies at the local level. Expectations are that districts will be operating generally on data-driven decision-making, as well as demands from Department of Ed and others, the federal government, for an increased amount of data. We are very interested in protecting student privacy. We will be hopefully joining in developing guidance to local school leaders in terms of best practices. We're not real sure where we would head legislatively, but certainly developing the kind of best practices strategies that could assist districts. The big and it was mentioned earlier, the big problem out there is that in part, most districts in the state of Oregon are very small, underfunded, understaffed, and the dedication of the state to assisting those districts will really tell whether this is going to be seriously taking on the question of data privacy, student privacy, or if it'll be just a series of additional regulations, laws that folks have to try to deal with, as you mentioned, Peter, as they're trying to fulfill their main mission, which is student achievement. So that'll be, I think, our interest is if serious, does it come with the kind of assistance that's really needed to deal with what are really complicated technical issues for some districts. And we're talking districts that barely have connectivity, let alone have the kind of in-house ESD level or even state level assistance that's really needed to deal with some sophisticated strategies that might develop.
It'll get back to me.
Hi, I'm Sherry Springer, State Representative from House District 17. I represent 5 school districts, 11 little cities. Been on a school board, and you know, I guess I am here for a couple reasons. One, I'm a parent of a student in a high school, barely still in that high school, graduating this next year. But I guess I'm focused on how we use data, why we need certain pieces of data, who needs that data, and then how we protect that data once it's collected. Sometimes we just feel really good if we have a lot of data. We do. Yeah, we got a lot of data. Well, what are we doing with that data? What's the purpose of that data? And is that something we truly need to have? And so I approach it from that extent, and certainly I don't know that we need a law to address this. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. And so I certainly want to be a part of those conversations.
I'm Lori Wimmer, Government Relations Consultant with the Oregon Education Association, representing 42,000 education personnel in pre-K through 14, community colleges as well. And I'm here because we are very concerned about all of the issues that have been raised previously and the balancing act between data integrity and privacy on one hand, and also making sure that whatever it is we might contemplate with respect to that security doesn't come at the expense of overburdening school districts and other education entities or confusing students and parents. We're interested in seeing if we can be as nimble as possible, understanding that technology changes constantly and that we have to anticipate ways to protect for the future, not just the present. And that we should be careful in our definition of terms. For example, the use of the term student outcomes, is that test scores and graduation rates, and what data is it that we're protecting precisely, and what indicators. And then finally, I wanted to add to the list of data breaches that was outlined in our report. As a parent of a middle schooler, I can tell you that last year, one entrepreneurial middle school child breached the Synergy system and was selling upgrades to the student grades for a price, and so it resulted in expulsion, but there was not one listed in our report this morning to the work group, and so who knows how many others out there that went unreported might exist. So there are all kinds of things to consider. I know that from all perspectives, as Becky mentioned, there is the yes but answer. Protect data, yes, but if we need information to understand what the incidence of sexual assault on a college campus is, for example, we don't want that. We want disaggregated data for that, right? So we don't want to have that anonymous. So there's a balancing act there, it would seem to me.
I'm Betsy Salter. I'm representing Oregon Save Our Schools. We're a group of parents and educators, retired educators, community members who have been concerned about how the federal education mandates have been translating into reduced investment in actual educational opportunities and the misuse of high-stakes test data to label students and schools and school districts, and now they want to use it more and more to evaluate teachers. It's really a misuse of data. And so that includes how federal mandates to collect student data could be harmful to our students. I'm a parent of a middle school, actually she's going into high school. And tell them about that. And so it's just, that's how I got involved with all this, is because I'm concerned about my daughter's education, and I believe all children should have access to a high quality public education.
I'm Bob Kieran. I head the Institutional Research and Planning Office for the Oregon University System. And for the last 30 years, we've been collecting unit record data on students and their activities in general for reporting and distribution of state appropriations and other things. And in many ways, I represent researchers rather than operational data people. And the possibilities with the research are huge in combining records. The liability may also be, so it's of great interest. Probably for the first 17 or 18 years I worked there, our security was don't give anybody any access at all, don't share any data. In the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a lot of demands to evaluate outcomes beyond what we have control over. So I probably could operate completely without personal identifiers until we want to know what happens at the next stage, or until we want to know what the preparation was coming in, and that's when we need to be able to have identifiers, and so that's the perspective I'm very interested in.
Good morning, my name is Kelly Garrett. I'm the Dean of Enrollment Management Systems. I'm also the Registrar at Lane Community College, and so I'm wearing my hat as the 2- and 4-year institution registrars. I've been training on the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act for 14 years. And this topic, I just did a national training for 500 registrars across the country last week. It terrifies registrars, private, public schools. They don't understand it. So I'm here to get some clarity on that. But a story that I would share that just represents the lament of the poor registrars out there is my own daughter, who went to South Eugene High School, but then came to Lane as a College Now student. So because she was enrolled at Lane, FERPA rights moved from me as the parent to she as a student. So when the Achievement Compacts came along, we were required to give information that went down to the grades of our high school College Now students over to 4J. So the lament of the poor registrar is that we're bound to protect student information, and that's what we're here to do. But I also know where my bread is buttered, that if I don't turn this over, I'm not going to be able to support the school districts as well as my own institution in the Achievement Compacts. So this is a really delicate moment for all of us, that how do we make sure that we're being, in terms of legal rights of FERPA and protecting that, but also supporting the very important efforts that we're doing in terms of the research. So I'm really glad to be here, and I'll be listening in on both what I know about this, but also because I am, if you Google FERPA expert, for some reason I show up, people all across the nation don't know what to do with this. It's a very, very scary place to be. What is a state educational agency? What is a local education agency? So it's a really important moment to be having this conversation, and we could continue to be a leader as we are nationally in Oregon, what we're going to do about this.
Hi, I'm Cindy Starkey. I'm currently in the General Counsel's Office at Portland State University, but my most recent job before this was working as Deputy General Counsel for the Oregon University System. And for the past few years, I've been working with Bob on these issues on data sharing, and my focus is obviously compliance and protecting student privacy. But you know, I've become very convinced of the value of these tools for longitudinal student data as an educational tool for improving outcomes, and I just want, my concern is making sure that as we do that, we're protecting student privacy and we're complying with FERPA as well as other applicable laws. And sometimes I think that the the regulations and the laws are just trying to keep up, and it's such a scramble, and it's a real challenge, and it's just a constant learning process, but at the same time trying to make regulations that don't really fit the world we live in somehow wrap around it, and so that's the challenge that we face.
Hi, I'm Ian Green. I'm with the Secretary of State. I'm a performance auditor, and I'm here representing Gary Wyatt, the Audits Director, who's currently out of state attending a business meeting. Our office sees a lot of value in the data that can be collected or matched with other systems. I'm currently working on a performance audit at the University of Oregon. I'm working with Bob and some other state agencies on matching some data to look at student outcomes, and we're hoping that can help drive state policies. So we want to protect that data in terms of the value it can provide to the state, but at the same time we want to make sure there's appropriate controls in place to protect that data, make sure that privacy is maintained.
I'm Jan McComb from the Department of Education, the Legislative Director, and I think I'm here because during the last session, 2014, Representative Frederick introduced a bill on student record privacy, and honestly, when I first read it, I thought, well, this is perfectly reasonable. I totally understand why someone would do that. But then as the staff got to really analyzing, the bill, there were some phrases that just needed to be changed. There were some bigger ideas that needed to be talked about. Some ideas put federal funds at risk, like Ben mentioned. And we realized, we did our best to try to amend it, but in the end, we just ran out of time with the short timelines of the short session. And as I had mentioned to Representative Frederick, I can bring you our issues, but there's a whole bunch of other folks out there. I don't know what higher ed's issues are and what their needs are, and really we need to get a lot of smarter people than me at the table to tell, advise how to write this bill.
Thank you all. And if members of the audience, if you could just state your name and the organization, if you represent an organization, just so we have a sense who's in the room, and then we'll do that for folks on the phone in just a sec. If we could start over there. Yes.
Hi, I'm Riley Bosca. I'm a student at Cleveland High School.
I'm Chris Alman, and I am with Oregon Save Schools.
I'm Lisa Schultz. I'm a parent in the Beaverton School District, although my child has now graduated, and I'm a former member of the Beaverton School Board.
I'm Laura McCoy. I'm from Oregon Career Information System at the University of Oregon.
Lori Sackville, the Oregon School Boards Association.
I'm Tess Milio. I'm with CFM, Strategic Communications, and we have several clients that care about privacy issues.
Jim Craven with representing Tech America, a national consortium of high-tech companies, and I assume it includes some in the educational data field, so we want to participate.
My name is Celeste Jansen. I run Oregon Mentors, which is a nonprofit that works with about 200 youth development organizations that support schools every day.
Cheryl Heemstra with the Oregon Department of Justice on behalf of Attorney General President.
Chelsea Clinton, Oregon Department of Education, Researching Data Analysis Unit.
Cheng-Fei Lai, OEIB Research Policy and Research Team.
Mike Rebar, OEIB.
Holly Cruzen, OEIB.
Thank you. And if folks on the phone, it's really hard on the phone to know who's supposed to go first, so we'll just see how well that works. If folks on the phone want to introduce themselves.
You need to unmute.
Hello, this is Matt Markey representing the College Board as well as TransUnion.
Anyone else? Okay.
Well, I wanted to say at least a couple of words here about sort of why I got into this. Some of them are stories. I'm going to try not to tell stories because I tend to tell too many stories as it is. There are some basic questions for me. Who owns your child's identity? Who owns your identity? Who owns your story? Who owns your child's story? And what would it mean to own those things? I've been asking these questions for some time because I saw several educational initiatives created without questions being asked about their impact on privacy, personal autonomy, or security. And if we don't make policy decisions on these issues, they'll be made for us. And the question is, what can we do with that data? Somebody should ask, what should we do with that data? Although a person's identity is intimately part of his or her personhood, we've not recognized that in terms of the kinds of protections we recognize for a person's physical self. We justify certain risks to privacy on the basis of the potential for research sometime in the future, whereas we expressly rule out such justification for risks imposed on a person's body. The leap in data collection and handling that has taken place in my lifetime can be compared to the transition from oral communication and the passing along of human knowledge via oral tradition to written records in libraries. But this transition now is taking place at a much faster rate. Writing your thoughts in a diary meant not only that you could go back and revisit them, but also that they could be read by another, transferred on purpose, or stolen. Posting your thoughts on Facebook means that they are released to the world, and the world can find them years from now. I have a picture of myself in 1973 that people cannot believe. My hair had been cut. I used to have a record of a 12-inch fro, so that kind of a picture is now available, and I don't have a problem with it being available. In fact, I put it up so that when my relatives and my friends found it, they wouldn't be able to put it up and say, "Look at what we found." But the fact is, that's a kind of thing that you can definitely see. But when it comes to our children, what about the records that we keep on them? A few years ago, a policy leader told me that enacting protections that I saw as basic would, and I'm going to quote here, endanger the longitudinal database. Now, who decided which was more important, the database or the person? So I hope that this group, drawing on the work done here and elsewhere, and on our varied expertise and perspectives, will craft some consensus regarding some of the questions that should be asked. I also hope that we can craft some consensus regarding the answers to those questions and delineate the choices to be made where we can't come to consensus. I want to say a couple of quick things. I am concerned about federal funding, but that is not the top concern for me. And I understand why it is for the Department of Ed and for state, other folks, but that is not the major concern for me. I am concerned about another story that comes to mind for me. I know that we were all absolutely perfect kids at 7th grade. I know that I was. I mean, the halo was over me for quite a bit there. The horns were holding it up, but the halo was over there. The fact is, I am concerned that if a 7th grader has a discipline problem, that somehow that discipline problem now in the cloud ends up being part of the decision that you make regarding accepting them to the University of Oregon. That is a concern, and I'm frankly concerned about much younger than 7th grade. I know that we spend a great deal of time trying to determine how well kids are doing at 3rd grade. And if they are in fact identifiable at 3rd grade, and even with the promise of an anonymity, I'm not convinced of the anonymity. It is the triangulation capabilities are rather extraordinary now. I'm not convinced that you can really become anonymous anymore. So I'm concerned that a 3rd grader is immediately not only identified as having problems with reading, but identified with the locate of the stigma that says you're a 3rd grader who has problems with reading. That's probably means you're going to be likely having problems when we get to when we'll be putting prison beds together for you. So we already identify you as someone we should be worried about and concerned about personally, not because of the situation around you, but because of you personally. That is a concern that I want to make sure that we are very careful about. And that's the matching data issue. I really think that we have to be very, very worried about that. And it is not just, again, 7th grade or 3rd grade. We are now testing kids at kindergarten and the early learning. One of the things that Jan brought up near the end of our discussions and near the end of the session was the fact that the Early Learning Council was concerned about what kind of data was going to be available there and what does that mean and who's keeping it. So these are the kinds of issues that I'm frankly concerned about, and it's the reason that I kept pushing to try to make sure that we had this kind of a gathering to talk about these issues. I hope that we will in fact come to some consensus on some things. I hope that I will be submitting some kind of a bill, so just so that you know. That I'm not sure what it is right now because I want to hear what people have suggestions and what concerns we might have, but we need to be doing something about this. You've noticed in other states, there's a very nice report that Peter and I've forgotten her name again.
Chen Fei
Put together. You can see what other legislators have done. There are a number of approaches that are being taken. There are also reports of breaches of student privacy, but I recall one that Jan remembers well because I was on the State Board of Education at the time, where we had a charter school that closed down, and all of the data from that charter school, several charter schools actually, it was in several different locations, all the data from that school was suddenly, no one knew who was supposed to be in charge of it. And that was printed data for the most part. There was some digital. These are the concerns that I think we need to try to address them. I agree wholeheartedly with that. The concern, we don't want to be burdening the smaller districts with this as much as we can. They need to have the support from the state, from wherever, ESDs, whatever, to really address this. But this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and frankly, I think we need to address it now. We cannot be waiting more and more. We really could have started talking about this a little bit earlier. In fact, I was talking about it in 2011, trying to get something together. 2015, we're going to have some kind of bill that I'll be presenting. Whether it passes or not is another story, but I'm certainly going to make sure that we have some discussion of it. So, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to review the agenda in just a second, and the first agenda item after the review is public testimony. Sometimes that comes at the end of the meeting, but I thought it would be great for the work group to hear public testimony in the mix with all of our sharing. So if you do want to do public testimony, there's a sign-up sheet over there. Just put your name on there and we'll follow the regular practice with that. Hopefully this is the last agenda that is just designed by the co-facilitators. We would really like the future agenda items to come from the work group as well. And actually today, if there are things on the agenda that don't meet with something that you really feel strongly should be discussed day one, I'm perfectly happy to see if it can be fit in or absolutely ensure that it's on the next meeting agenda. What we're going to do after we hear public testimony is we're going to look at some critical context for this question. Representative Frederick might be providing extra information on that, but the other thing that we're going to do as a group is we're going to take a look at the report that we produced for this group. You may have had a chance to read it, you may not have, that's fine. We're going to do some activities with this report to dig in a little bit deeper on some of the issues and do some discussion around them. And I should mention that we'll have a break. I was thinking about 9:30. And then maybe another one at 11:30-ish, but we'll see. I'd like people not to have to feel like they're leaving and missing really critical stuff. We're going to talk about what is the final outcome of the group, maybe in a little bit more detail. We've heard a lot of signals around the table. Some have talked legislation, some have talked policy, some question about whether we need laws or not. I think talking about that a little bit more gives our agency a little bit more direction on what information we should be bringing forward. And that discussion could go into some depth, and I have a process to do that. If the committee, if we can't just do a roundtable or popcorn on that, I've got a process that we can do. And then towards the end of the meeting, we're looking for direction on timeline, especially from the representatives present, on when you would expect or need information in terms of, my understanding is, as a novice, that legislation that's crafted well in October has a way better chance of passing than something later, which is just news to me. It's good information to know that the timeline is accelerated. So I think it's good to be talking about timeline. What would our meeting schedule would be? Do we want to break up into work groups? Do we want to keep meetings a large group and things like that? Then towards the end, I'd really like to discuss membership. Are there people who should be here who aren't represented, and what's the group's feeling about that? It's sort of random who's here. To some degree, you represent obvious constituencies, but there might be some that are obvious that we missed. So I'd like to talk about that. And then finally, and if you could be thinking about this as we go along, any final comments about the format, the room, the time, anything about the meeting that really didn't work for you or really did work? So the next time we do it, we can fashion a better structure to more adequately meet our needs. So that's kind of what the agenda looks like moving forward. And before we go to public testimony, I'd just like to ask any initial reactions to the agenda from the work group, any things that you think, no, we shouldn't do that, or hey, why isn't this on the agenda? Okay, so now I'd like to do public testimony, and here I just want to make sure I say the right thing. I've never opened a public testimony session. In a school district I have, but I think it's a little bit different. I don't know if Rep. Springer or Rep. Frederick, are there particular things we say? I know you're not allowed to personally criticize.
That's true. We'll stop. We'll check on folks. Make sure that we're looking for information here. That's what we're looking for. That's important. I think you only have 3 people right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then 3 minutes.
That's
is that
good.
adequate? Although if you want to go 3 minutes and 10 seconds, I'm sure that's going to work. So, Celeste Jansen.
Good morning, and thank you. As I said earlier, my name is Celeste Jansen, and I'm the Executive Director of Oregon Mentors. I'm here representing a group that I don't see on the work group, and that's youth development organizations. So I wanted to highlight just a couple of our concerns and make sure that I put them in front of you as you're having this conversation. I think that youth development organizations provide a very important services for education and for students. And many of the students that need additional support in our schools get that support through nonprofits that are serving schools. We're in a really interesting position where speaking to kids with discipline issues is a great example, where nonprofits are tasked with identifying those students or having a source to identify the students who they need to serve, finding out what is the source if they're having discipline problems. Is that because of problems with dental? Is that because of stress management? Is that because the teacher is more likely to have more incidences of discipline than other teachers? There's a lot of questions that nonprofits are trying to sort out and how to best deliver services to support students. At the same time, funders are asking us outcomes. When we actually work with kids, what's our outcomes? How many of the kids that are served in various nonprofits have a graduation rate? There's a lot of questions that nationally, youth development and education are really trying to grapple. From Oregon, I see that the RACs and this collective impact focus is really bringing community and schools together. But data is a key driver of a lot of decisions, and I see that really continuing to be difficult. I want to highlight 2 examples of how data could really help nonprofits. First of all, there's a great program that nationally is recognized at absolutely helping support students called Check to Connect. And this program, when a student doesn't come to school, not only does a phone call go home to a parent, but a phone call goes home to an individual that is that child's mentor that then can immediately follow up with support. This is done in many other states. They do it through FERPA in a way that is acceptable, but it helps bring that nonprofit into the intervention to really support students. This is something with lots of data, lots of evidence. It actually is in the What Works Clearinghouse. I also know another mentoring program in Texas that wasn't very effective in supporting students. And in fact, kids that were enrolled in it felt like they had a bit of a stigma and were more likely to ditch schools on days when they were supposed to be going to the program. So things like that are really important to know if these services that we're bringing into the schools support kids are being more effective or less effective. And so having youth development at the
Can
table.
you hold on just one second?
Yeah.
Someone's on the phone. If you can mute your phone, we've got you back on. We're hearing a little bit there. Thank you.
Sorry.
No problem. Furthermore, I'd just like to say I think school climate surveys are really an interesting source of data that we don't really look at when we're talking about education. But if kids are not feeling motivated or not feeling engaged in school, is that because of something with being bullied? Is that because of support? They don't believe that there's a element of support there. So some of these data issues that might be about a broader context of what the school is like, but it also might be about how one particular student could be best served. Finally, I know that the Department of Education is interested in measuring engagement and motivation, and there's a lot of talk about non-cognitive skills and grit and perseverance, and we really are learning a lot as a field about what sort of things we'd like to measure and how we can really use that in a way that makes sense. I'm hoping that when there is a database, we know what to hold on to, what not to hold on to, what to share, what not to share, but also that there's flexibility, because I think a lot of things that we don't know everything now, and in 20 years we're going to say we wish we would have measured this. This is really important for student achievement, for student identity. And so that flexibility at the beginning of designing something, I think that there will be things that in the future, when it comes to school climate and achievement, motivation, academic identity, we know these concepts are really important, and how they fit in, it's not really clear. Thank you.
I just wanted to, I just want to make sure I understood what you were saying. Are you talking about serving both as a repository of data as well as access to school data as a nonprofit organization? I just want to kind of understand where you would stand on the food chain of data collection.
I think that some nonprofits do collect student data. Other nonprofits, it's more about access.
Are they collecting though for themselves and to meet their grant requirements, or are they collecting to become part of that permanent record for that individual student? I mean, are they sharing it back with the districts?
There hasn't been a lot of sharing back. It's really been about an individual nonprofit determining how to best use services and use that data themselves. But then there are instances, and I think around the Regional Achievement Collaborative, where there might be conversations about sharing back. And I also think that right now it just kind of feels like there is not a lot of criteria or understanding around how youth development and education data systems should be working together. In different communities, there have been separate databases that have been built, so there's been something that's a open source system so that schools and nonprofits can use something different than the permanent student record.
Who's done that in Oregon?
No one in Oregon.
Okay.
That's in Cincinnati.
In Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just should you trying to understand whether you ought to be involved, I mean, real directly in this. Do you have security practices? I mean, if you're collecting through your access to students in public schools, you're collecting data on those students. What's the security with your data?
So every nonprofit does it differently, and Oregon Mentors ourselves, we're not direct service. We work with many different nonprofits that are youth development nonprofits. They all have varying levels of data. A lot of them don't have access to data.
But they're developing data on individual students with identifiers of some kind.
Not necessarily the student identified data that they don't necessarily use the same codes that school use, but they do try to have something about how students can, what are their indicators when they come in and when they leave, so that they can measure it for their own grants. So there are many different data systems that nonprofits are using.
But what I'm trying to understand is, my grandkid now comes into your program to be mentored. You develop a file on you've somehow accessed my grandchild through the public schools. You're developing a file. Is there do you identify that child in your organizations? Do you know? I guess I grew up in an era of the permanent record. God knows what it is or where it is anymore. This has become clear. It's somewhere in the cloud. And I'm wondering if you are part of the permanent record development based on nonprofits, mentors, federal or donor guidelines for granting. I'm just trying to understand how you all fit into the mix of developing information about my grandchild that has not gone through, hopefully, some screening that may be occurring as a function of law covering public schools. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say that there appears to be a separation between nonprofits that do their own intake, so they will ask parents information, and that's their source of data. It's usually around parent surveys and not necessarily from schools, or sometimes there's parent permission. So from schools, they'll say, since participating in my program, does the student seem like they can identify themselves as a reader better? We very rarely have access to grades, and funders are wanting to see access to grades. If they enroll in a tutoring program, are their grades in math improving? That's important to know, but it's not necessarily something that every program has the same ability to get. Some nonprofits that are operating after school programs have more access to data, and some nonprofits have very little. Some nonprofits are also running charter schools. So when we're talking about nonprofits and data, it's the entire gamut.
Well, this is a whole area
Yeah.
that to me is a mystery area that doesn't sound like it's governed. Unlike, I think, at least to the level public schools are governed in terms of controls on data. So I would be very interested in this on some future agenda to explore what they've got, what they're doing with it, who has access to it, how does it relate to that child's future when they come to register? I don't know, and it concerns me to hear this. Not negatively, but just, wow, there is another dimension to this issue.
I would say that most nonprofits, the data that is collected is not fed back in to become a part of the permanent record.
There is a permanent record?
If there is, who knows?
Good.
But I just think that how nonprofits and schools are interacting is very not clear. And again, this is a perfect conversation if we're having a conversation around student data where we should be at the table and talking about what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing. And nonprofits, I would say, are very knowledgeable about not only FERPA, but also HIPAA, and that some nonprofits are also serving kids in a mental health capacity, and so they are very interested in complying with the law, both around FERPA and HIPAA.
Thank you. I hope you don't mind. The Q&A is so helpful to us to examine these issues.
Great.
Chris Allman.
Chris, just before you start, Jim, I'd like to have you, if you wouldn't mind, talking about some things at some point too, because she was talking about nonprofits. We had a conversation earlier about for-profits, so I'd like to have you talk about that. Thank you.
Hello again, I'm Chris Allman, Oregon Save Our Schools. And first of all, I really, really appreciate this work group getting together. And Lou, your comments were spot on about identity. I have to tell you, my husband and I suffered taxpayer-related identity theft this March. It is the most violating thing to have happened, to respond to, and to learn, frankly, that the IRS is functioning on 70s computers that with the Modernization Act compelled to get returns back very quickly. We are now about 85% of the country e-filing. And as you think about the ramifications in terms of all the data sharing that goes into not only educational records, but that which cross-links into health records because of the Obamacare and on, we see a huge mess. I'm a physician by education. I started my interest in this topic a few years ago when I first learned about Project Dollar, advancing let's see, it stands for Advancing Longitudinal Data in Education Reform, and I learned about that at the OEIB. There I learned that it was 5 agencies that was intended to share data, including the employment department, which I haven't heard anybody talk about that potential agency for sharing data. And I was able to convince Jan to send me a CD of my son's state longitudinal records. I don't know, maybe I'm still the only person in the nation that's requested that information. And I have to admit, I saw this dizzying array of file formats that I had to try to translate what the data meant. I saw that my son was labeled as a dropout 4 times while in elementary school, which reflected, I believe, coding idiosyncrasies that couldn't quite match the data together. And I saw a suspension on his records and things that made me feel queasy as I started to learn that these records would be retained for 75 years. And so I started learning more and more what I could about data privacy, including for HIPAA, which is where another arena where I am with the Oregon Health Policy Board, advocating vehemently for data privacy there as well. The big data requires something that goes against one important principle of fair information practices, and that's data minimization. And because it's all about maximizing data, that means you're going to the clouds, you're going to third parties where you can't have that kind of control, where you can't audit what's happening with the data. And that is extremely concerning to me, especially as I've heard Lori mention how Synergy, the state's school information systems, was breached. These are the kinds of things that we have to be mindful of, because it's not just what the state is working on. It's these data systems. It's what kids are doing when they're working on the computers and perhaps being tracked by companies that might have, Khan Academy or whatever, following these kids. I don't have the solutions either, but I am extremely grateful that these discussions are coming to the fore. And I might mention the agency that I think should have a role here too is the Oregon Health Authority, because the early education groups that are involved with data sharing include many of the preschool determinants of health, which is there was a waiver of the federal government that is getting a HIPAA waiver to get information, so that's all shared too. So I really would like to see that happening, and I guess I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the work group?
I don't have a question, but it's come up a couple times, so I think I should clarify as far as data in the cloud. And I don't know, I can't speak to all 196 school districts on what they're doing, but in terms of Synergy is a vendor, but all of that data of the districts that are using Synergy are all still hosted locally. Synergy itself does not host any student data.
But that speaks to the very issue of how the local school districts, and especially rural ones, are going to be having difficulty wending their way through the tunnel.
Yes.
So.
Yep. Yeah, no, I totally agree. We definitely need to address this in a way that gets at the small school districts, because they're the ones that are going to have the most trouble with this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And finally, Lisa Schultz. All right, and then Jim. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Lisa Schultz. As I said, I'm a Beaverton parent and a former member of the Beaverton School Board. And I'm just delighted to see all of you here today. I know this is a huge time commitment, and I really appreciate that this group is coming together to talk about what certainly has been a top priority for what I've been working on since leaving the school board. I don't have prepared remarks, but I just thought I'd share, based on listening to all of you, a few things that I noted. First was, as was just mentioned, the whole idea of third-party access I didn't hear called out explicitly, and that is just huge. School districts more and more are partnering with third parties, and they don't have clear guidelines on how to do that. So that, as a specific area, would be great if you all could work on that. Also, just to note that there are long-standing frameworks for data privacy, and I know Ms. Strauss she didn't list them, but they were as belonging to the Fair Information Practices, but that's essentially what they were. There's also, the United States is an OECD country, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and they have very specific guidelines as well for how to treat and handle data. The whole data minimization issue, I guess as all of you talked about data, I didn't hear a distinction between what's become known as education analytics or big data analytics versus how we've traditionally used data. Data is not new to educational systems. We've been gathering it for a very long time. I've been part of a longitudinal study in terms of workforce study for many years, and I still participate in that. I guess when I think of traditional research and longitudinal studies, that's been done with participants who were aware that they were part of that study. They gave their permission, as I did, to be part of that study. And I think many, if not most people, when they receive assurances about how their information will be treated, would participate in such a study. Concern that I have as we've moved, especially since the longitudinal database was established here in Oregon, that somehow there's this assumption that we have, or institutions have, a right to just take data as opposed to asking permission. So I think that's something that we haven't had a conversation about. Is that an okay thing to do, or should we ask permission before we do that, and how do we do that? Representative Frederick called this out, although he didn't name this. There was discussions about the use of data and its benefits in terms of seeing how different subgroups are treated and making conclusions from that. And we're all familiar with racial profiling and age profiling and all kinds of profiling. But I think out of big data, one of the things that I'm concerned about, as Representative Frederick alluded to, is the whole idea of data profiling. That if your data matches these data points, then therefore we know this about you. But data is not what we call deterministic. These are nothing more than statistical uses of data. So we really need to be careful with that, as well as the Statistics 101. Correlation is not causation. So even if we note something, we note a correlation, we need to understand the underlying causes of that. You're not going to get causation out of big data analytics. You're going to have to go and dig deeper. So anyway, that's just something that I think we need to be talking about. There are risks associated with big data analytics, and there's not one proven, everyone keeps saying we're going to get these great breakthroughs on the basis of big data. We haven't done that yet. There have been some big mistakes. MIT Review did an article about some things that happened during the Vietnam War that were huge mistakes that they based on data correlations. So anyway, that's just another thing I hope you'll take into consideration. And as far as groups to include, I would like to suggest the Oregon School Boards Association. I don't know if they're
invited.
Okay. The Beaverton School Board in 2013 passed a resolution related to data privacy, and so I think that parents are very, very interested in this topic, and when they find out about it, and I guess maybe that's something else you can talk about, this isn't something that parents really know. I would bet that if you can find 3 parents that even know there is a longitudinal database in the state, you'd be lucky. And that's really how I became interested in this after I left the school board. As I said, I sat on that school board for all those years while the longitudinal database was being created. I had no idea. We talked about data all the time. I knew we were collecting data, but I had no idea that we took personally identifiable information and then sent that to the state. I thought it was all aggregated. So anyway, those are my comments. My last one is about something that helped me in terms of security versus privacy. Data security obviously is very important. It deals with unauthorized access. Privacy is about authorized access and who you want to see and use your information. So anyway, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate this opportunity.
And if you don't mind waiting, I know I had one question, which is both you and Chris mentioned data minimization. Could you define that? Because I want to make sure I understand what that term means exactly.
So you want to, and I think Ms. Strauss is probably more the authority on this than I would be, but fair information practices, and I don't have a copy of my fair information practices with me, and also OECD guidelines talk about don't gather more data than what you need, and that is in direct conflict with big data. Because big data says get as much as you can from as many places as you can. So that's really something that needs to be part of your discussion, I hope.
Thank you. I wondered. Any other questions from the work group? Thank you very much. We have one more speaker who's been a command performance.
A very complex testimony
yes,
here.
I can see.
Thought I'd show it to you. I can fax you a copy.
On an iPad there.
That's right. My battery died. Jim Craven, representing Tech America. Tech America is a national trade association of technology companies. I've represented the industry for, just calculated, 25 years here in Salem in this building, and worked with many of you on these kinds of issues. Obviously within the technology industry, there are many firms who are providing tools for this endeavor. I think in 2 major areas. One, to improve customized learning experiences. And then the other big bucket would probably be administrative things, the outsourcing of just making your computers work, and when you have mandates to collect data, providing tools and software so you can do that. I think the industry is on the same page with most of the people here, I believe, in terms of standing for strong data protection and also standing for transparency in use, in that data is only used for the intention for which you were contracted to use it, not used for ancillary commercial purposes. I think that's generally the metric. And as concerns about privacy grow, and they are growing on a daily basis in this society, firms are going to have to be trusted partners if they're going to be able to get contracts and work with government agencies. So I think where I just want to say that in many issues where we've worked with the legislature over the years, whether it's regulating spam email from about 15 years ago, how did that work? But I think we eliminated it. With the last session where we worked on the social media bills, the so-called Facebook bill about what employers and schools can ask about your individual login information. So we've been at the table on many of these issues and have appreciated working with lots of you, like Jan and like Becky and Representative Frederick. I think it will come down to, and I'm just guessing because I'm digging into this issue like we all are at the current time. It does come down sometimes to definitions. You could be on the same page and then have concerns about how a word is used, and oftentimes this is unintended consequences. sort of as Jan McComb mentioned. As the private sector engages with you in this debate over the coming months and years, just remember that because someone says, excuse me, section 3 sub B I have a problem with, doesn't mean we are trying to railroad the issue or don't believe in the same goals. And so to the extent that I can in this debate, and my national group just reorganized yet again, so I'm still trying to find out whether we have dues-paying members who are in this space. I suspect we might, but I'm still doing my own research to find out whether I will have a dog in this fight and be before you in 2015. But that to the extent that I can serve as a resource to bring those specifics, those details, those questions about unintended consequences to the table and help in the process, I'm here to be able to do that.
Thank you. Jim, one of the reasons I asked you to come forward is we were talking about nonprofits and how they are dealing with data. With the for-profit companies that are collecting for school districts often, that's been a confusion as well for you folks, from what I can gather. Am I correct on that? What's expected from those particular companies, and how schools are able to handle those kinds of issues?
Well, thank you, Representative. It's already been mentioned earlier today that the importance of clear guidance it's critical. It's important in the public realm, so school districts know what they're supposed to be doing, what they have to do, what they don't have to do, their relationships with parents and students, and those trust relationships. And then it comes down to taking that information, and at some point it has to come into an RFP or a contract with an actual provider that says, here's what we want you to do, here's what we do not want you to do, here's your limits. So everybody needs to know both at the policy guidance and then at the specifics of how, what are the terms and conditions of an actual contract in a commercial relationship. So all that's important, and without that, people are going to kind of, figure it out on the fly, and that's not an ideal situation. It's ideal that the rules of the game are very explicit, because that's what the private sector wants. What are the rules? Can we live with those rules? Can we contract to do that? And we will, and then be held accountable to do what we promised and no more, no less. So.
Any other questions?
We at Lane Community College, in light of declining resources, are having to make some tough decisions to outsource work that used to be done by our colleagues. And right now, I'm working on an RFP to outsource transcripting. And that's what schools are doing. So I just want to honor that it's a really important conversation with for-profits. What our for-profit partners might see as important about the data is not the same. And even if I give our transcripting data and all of the contracts say it's okay, that data still belongs to me as Lane Community College to protect, but I've just sent it elsewhere. And if you want to talk about scary, talk about Google and Gmail, which most of our institutions of higher education are using for our and they're like, yeah, sure, we're good. So it's a scary thing. So I think it's something that we need to really talk about, because we are outsourcing more and more of our work that we did before, because we have to, and what kind of safeguards are in place for that. So I really appreciate remembering the for-profits.
Yeah, I take your point about the fact that once we come up with language, if in fact this group helps to do that, that we have to be taking great care in the legislative drafting so that the parameters are very clear, so that once it is operationalized, that is done in a way that meets the needs and the intent. With respect to those third parties having even temporary access to sensitive data, would you support, or do you think your clients would support, some sort of sidebars that make it clear that for the purpose of the use of that data, they are in effect deputized and held to some sort of higher standard of data security with consequences for breaches in terms of the use of that data?
Lori, I can't necessarily promise exactly where we're going to be. I'm studying this myself and figuring out where my members are. But, the good thing about this debate is you're not starting from scratch. There's several states that have adopted new frameworks, Oklahoma and others.
that have legislation that you certainly can look at and don't need to start from scratch. And there are existing frameworks, both federal and Oregon state law, that generally put sidebars on data and responsibilities to protect and encrypt and all that. So while this debate is the educational part of the debate, there'll be a broader debate, I suspect, in the 2015 session beyond the student record issue about the overall privacy debate. I mean, I don't think it's overly dramatic to say that the debate is raging. Everywhere, federal, state, globally. And so, I mean, we have it, and we can bring some of that and work with Peter. There's existing state law in Oregon that says anybody that has data has to do these things, has to have protections in place, has to notify if there's a breach. I mean, that's current law. We may tweak some of that in the 2015 session. The AG has some ideas on that. But so we start with a framework, a broad framework, and we also start with some work that's been done in many states and some model legislation in this more narrow student privacy part. So we just have to react, see whether people who've come before us have done the right thing or not, but at least we'll have a little bit of a leg up to know whether other people have had good ideas or not.
Jim, thank you. I want to echo something you just mentioned. The Attorney General had a really impressive gathering about 2 months ago, I guess it was, that talked about this issue on a much broader issue. One portion of it talked about student data, but most of it was talking about some general privacy issues regarding technology. You know, I am old enough to remember APL, which most programmers would not recognize at all. It was called a programming language. Heck, I was one of the guinea pigs for IBM back in the mid-'60s to learn about computers, and they were convinced that these high school students would never be able to understand it because it was too complex an issue. Of course, we proved them wrong, but that's another story. Statute of limitations has run out on most of that, from what I understand, so I'm not worried about it.
Change the grades?
Oh, yeah. No, we didn't change the grades. No, we didn't change any grades. Let me be very clear about that. There were other things, but we did not change any grades. But the point is that we will be continuing to have increases or changes in technology, and there will be upgrades, and there will be people looking at that. I'm not surprised to hear that the middle school students have managed to breach that. But that's something that we're going to have to continue to worry about. And I'm glad to see the conversation. And your group, your team has been really helpful with that, because they know that the commercial breaching is something that can be damaging for everybody. So,
if in conclusion, I don't know if you saw the headline this morning about this Russian outfit that. Yep. My God, I would advise all of you to go home tonight, change all your passwords. You should be doing it on a regular basis. Most of us don't, but just another reminder, particularly those ones that deal with finances, go home and write a really strong password tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've reached the time for our first break. Is 15 minutes the realistic? I think we say fewer. So let's get back together at 10 of 10. Thank you. If we could reconvene. First off, I neglected to thank in our introductions Angela Bloom, who's my executive assistant at OEIB. She's over here. Angela not only prepared a lot of the information for all of us here, but she's a real interested parent and observer and supporter to this effort in terms of thinking through a lot of the issues. We just had a really good short discussion about the next agenda and a lot of the things that are coming up. So I just want to thank Angela for all the support you give this group, and we'll continue to. Also, right after the break, I had the opportunity to get some really critical feedback from both of the representatives on either side. And we determined a couple of things. One is that we don't need to go till 12 o'clock, just because that's the amount of time that we set out. To be honest, I really had no idea if we would get this level of sharing and this concrete stuff that we need to do further research on and definition of, and it was really welcome, not only the members of the work group, but everybody who came up and spoke and answered questions. And I feel like my list of new agenda items, things to research, things to inquire about, it already fills up a page just sitting here, and Angela took notes as well. So I think there's a lot for staff to go back and work on. In addition, Ben Tate, who now is left to go home to help take care of his family, was interested in having the Oregon Department of Education do a presentation to the group on some specific things that were raised during the discussion. And it's possible that that also is something that higher education would want to do in order to further define and identify some of the issues from the perspective of the agencies, schools, or institutions, and then to allow some back and forth in terms of questioning, just to sharpen the discussion that we have here around a lot of terms that are being used that have not been defined. Some of the terms I think that we're talking about today are defined, as was said before, in law, in legislation, in research that's been done. Much of it's included in the report that we provided, but some of it isn't. So our vision of the next session is to take quite a bit of the feedback that we've gotten so far and to do that delineation, definition, distinction of terms that is so critical that was raised in the last piece of public testimony about language. So I don't think we're going to need a whole lot of time today to generate more of that. However, what is needed today before we break up is a discussion about next steps and what folks' sense of what we need to do in the short term and the medium term in order to help, especially Representative Frederick, to move forward on this legislative concept. So with regard to that, I just want to share a little bit of the initial thinking about areas that we might be doing policy recommendation as a group or giving feedback on. And then I'd like to inquire with the group, well, what are our next steps? When should the next time we meet, what should we be doing? And so number 5 on the agenda, I'd envision that this could be an hour-long agenda item looking into the report and really digging. And it's not going to be an hour, it's going to be a couple of minutes. But just to throw out some ideas so that we can get feedback on it. It seemed to break down for us when we looked at this issue into certain groupings of ideas. And I think the groupings that are listed on the agenda do not span the whole set of issues that we just heard about. I already see that the 3 listed here are not inclusive of all the issues. So that's really helpful information. I love spanning the set, and this doesn't span the set. But just to say what they are, because they are on the agenda, and I think it's important to have that thinking out there, is we saw that there's at least 3 issues here. And again, there's probably 5, but there's at least 3. And one has to do with existing or possibly new legislation or policies specifically having to do with student data. And as we had from one of our folks who testified, there's authorized use of student data and other unauthorized use to sort of subsets of that topic. A second topic, and this is the Secretary of State's office being here, brought up the idea of audits. But it's not only audits maybe from a state's perspective in terms of state auditing, but to my mind as a school district person, self-audits can be a very, very important and helpful tool for districts or schools just to even know what questions they should be asking on a day-to-day basis. What are the top things? It would be a help, sort of what Chuck Bennett was saying. You know, maybe we don't need laws, maybe we do, but we certainly some guidance and technical assistance would be helpful. And self-audits can be helpful for guiding that kind of thinking, and it's possible there's other senses of the word audit where we look at what our practices are and review them, but certainly there's the self, and then maybe there's also the state. And then the final one, and this came up over and over and over in the discussion the first hour, is acceptable use. How do we think about the hydraulic that we saw over and over this morning between the use of data for the betterment of the state, of the school, of the district, versus the possible risk associated with the use of that data. I think we heard that, and my guess is, although maybe this is incorrect, but my guess is all of us feel that there is benefit that does not justify the risk. And I think everybody probably agrees with that one. I don't know if everybody agrees that there are benefits to the use of data that do justify some small risk. I'm not sure if that's true or not. There may be folks here who say that nothing justifies any risk, whatever the benefit might be. I just don't know. But I think that's one, again, it's a hydraulic that folks in the field wrestle with all the time about the sharing and the benefit of it versus that possible risk. And whether that's guidance, whether that's legislation, whether it's policy, or whether it's just some really good debate and discussion that could inform others, I think it's really, really critical that we fashion some of our thinking around that debate. And I think it's unquestionably true that big data could possibly someday find some conclusion that would be beneficial. And I think it's also unquestionably true that there's a huge risk there, as was identified. And I think that's just a really interesting topic for us to weigh in on. And finally, I just want to mention one thing, because I can't let it go before we get to our process statement. Laura McCoy, who's here from Career Information System, didn't want to do testimony, but I want to mention it because it didn't come up. But then Laura and Representative Frederick talked about it right after the meeting, which is the student voice. So Representative Frederick, among the other folks that we talked about having on the committee, has identified that we should have a K-12 student. We've got a post-secondary, what about a K-12 student here? And then the power of the data for the individual student and the family, I don't think really came up too much in the discussion. Although it did come up in terms of getting your child's information and then not knowing what to make of some of it, and then finding stuff that's wrong. Where is that voice in the discussion? Because I think we all really want to know what it says about us. Wouldn't we all like to know what our children's record says, or our record says? And that idea of ownership and empowerment for the actual owner of the data, I just think is an interesting thing to bring into the room. So those were some of the pillars that we were thinking we would move forward with. I think we would add, we heard about nonprofit, we heard about for-profit, we heard about some other things that we would add. And so at this point, we're not going to really delve more into that, but I just put that out just to see if there's any comments from the group, real disagreements about those ideas, or things that need to be included in terms of the analysis.
Representative Springer brought up some things as well, and I know she wanted to say something. So
yeah, and a couple or more things that I think we need to look at, and I just wrote, as I often do, cautions to myself as I walk through this process, and I would just offer them up for whatever value they may or may not have to the group. A couple things that I heard is the size of the net from the beginning of this conversation at 8 o'clock, or when we were done, about 9 o'clock, I guess, done with introductions, to now has become very broad. So I think it's important for me, at least, to look how broad is that net. So I asked myself the question, are we looking at, because Representative Frederick said that he will be introducing a bill, so are we looking at a bill to govern school districts and the management of their students' data, or are we looking at a bill to govern children, people under the age of 18, their data? And I think that there's a huge, huge difference there. And so I think it's very important for this group to decide soon what is it we want to govern. Because if we are governing the school district, how do nonprofits or profits or any organization, the Boys and Girls Club out there that does great stuff in our community, what have we done to their ability to interact? Do we want to, or do we not want to impact that ability? I started thinking, and it was mentioned a couple of times, I started going back a few years ago when HIPAA came in. I cautioned myself, and I offer that to the group as we continue through this conversation. that we don't place school districts and people that have the best interest of kids in a box to the point they can't impact kids. That we have teachers in the student lounge that, oops, we can't have those conversations anymore. And I know that that sounds a little like the sky's falling and paranoia, but we do it in the legislature all the time. We end up making laws, setting policy that goes there. And so I grab that caution for myself. I do see a great deal of value between school districts and local organizations, whatever they may be. I don't want to eliminate that value and the benefit to students that they can receive. The other thing is, I heard two conversations come up different times. Are we talking about firewalls? Are we talking about protecting that data in the system, or are we talking about using it? But these conversations became very intertwined, I noticed. And this is just my 2 cents worth. As far as the makeup of this committee, I see no student. I see no parent only. Lots of us are parents up here, but we also wear a different hat, and we have different filters. I think there needs to be a parent of this. I'm thinking of the person who collects data and maintains it in a school district. I don't see present. I really don't. We talked a lot about small school districts here, and everybody that knows me knows I'm all about small school districts. They need to be here. They need to be here and say the nuts and bolts of doing that is this, and that's good, or that's bad, or that's doable, or that's expensive, or whatever. I definitely would like to see student, parent.
We do have one student here.
Not K through 12.
Not K-12.
Yeah, K-12, which is primarily
that's why
the
I
conversation,
suggested that
yeah.
as well. Yeah.
And then somebody collects data in a school district.
You're thinking like a registrar or something like that?
I'm thinking
Around?
about in different school districts, you give them different titles, but
Okay.
clearly the person who collects that data, whether that's the secretary, the office manager, the business director,
Absolutely.
principal,
Absolutely.
whatever.
Let me just quickly say, Riley Bosca is sitting over there. She is visiting with me today. She has, we roped her into coming to Salem today, and she wanted to see what the Capitol was like.
Good.
She's not acting as a representative of K-12 at this particular point, but she is here, and I just wanted to have her get a chance to see what we were doing here.
So since we've had that break, any other work group members want to comment?
I'll take it. Actually, the notes I made sound a lot like what Representative Springer just said. To me, I put the various issues that we seem to land on in our early discussions into 3 basic boxes that I hope we can keep separated but pay focused attention to. One is data use, which has to do with what the legitimate uses are, users are, what data points we collect. The second is data privacy, which has to do with empowerment of the owners of the data, granting authorization or permission to use it, to collect it, to store it, to share it. And then the third is data security, which has to do with the firewalls, the protections, the mechanics of how we protect the data from unauthorized use, breaches, etc. And so I think that those are 3 very separate conversations, and if there's legislation, I think they have an integrated moment in any kind of bill because they bleed into each other. But, and that's why I think definitions are also important, that we have to be very clear about what it is we're talking about in what contexts. And not to get ahead of the group at all, but one of the things that kept occurring to me as we think about solutions to the problems that are identified is whether or not, and one of the testifiers made the point about authorization versus unauthorized data in big data versus data minimization, is that maybe one of the solutions would be an opt-in system for parents in K-12 and for students themselves in post-secondary, so that data could not be collected and stored and used and shared without the student or the parents' express permission, so that there's some sort of short-circuiting for those who feel unwilling to be a part of something that has any risk involved. Other people can make decisions about risk versus benefit, but if I'm a data point inside that system, I ought to have some kind of stop button. if I choose.
Over here, first.
I was just going to add that something that came up during some conversations during the break was financial aid and on-campus services and third-party vendors and data that goes to those organizations or companies in protection. I think we can maybe all agree that when it comes to financial aid and student loans, that information is pretty important for students to keep secured, and it follows them for the rest of their lives post-graduation. So having some sort of framework around financial aid, and to add maybe somebody from the financial aid in higher education to the group.
Thank you.
Yeah. As best as we can to represent what you're saying about it, but I want to make sure that when we're done, that real people can understand our output. I get paid a lot of money, that's paying my children's educational loans, to teach FERPA that's so complicated, and what happens is people just give up and they don't do it. So it's really important for the person in the rural school district, or the registrars, or the parents and students, to understand this and not make it, with all due respect, so legalese that they just turn a blind eye. So if there's anything I would hope, and we really do have to thin down to that laser point, what is it we're trying to say, so that as we go out and educate everyone, what did we just do?
Other members of the work group. Jim.
At the risk of repeating, because I think my ideas are summed up by your ideas too, I heard questions about, in terms of topics that this group could address. What data is gathered and by whom? How is it used? Who has access to that data? What are the security protocols in place and what needs to be in place? And then 2 subcategories would be, how do you change data that's wrong and maybe opting out? And Ben had said that we could come in and talk about what data we collect for what uses. And I think higher ed would be willing to do that too. And then the real policy discussion is around, is that a proper use of the data? Who has access to the data? Are the security protocols tough enough?
Thank you. Yes.
I just have some concern that whatever legislation is drafted is keeping in mind FERPA and being consistent with FERPA, so that we don't create 2 separate systems for people to have to try and figure out and comply with. I'm just concerned about the same things that Helen just mentioned. Once things get so complicated, the tendency is for people just to turn a blind eye, which concerns me, because then we're not in compliance and we're not doing what we need to be doing. So I remember when the privacy regulations in HIPAA were passed, 10 years ago, however long ago that was, and I remember the phrase HIPAA hysteria, because people were freaking out so much about compliance that it did sort of hamstring a lot of getting things done, or, the flip side of it, people just ignored it. So, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, to make sure that we're looking at what's already there, what's already in place, and being consistent with it to the extent possible.
Thank you. Others in the committee?
Yeah. So one of the things I'd like to see is figuring out what's the right avenue for what would perhaps be introduced as legislation, what should perhaps be introduced as a policy, what should be a standard, and who should be doing that. So one of the concerns I've seen is that we already have different legislation and laws passed. The Consumer Identity Theft Protection Act is one that it's just general consumer. So it probably doesn't address all the elements down to the student level, but there are really good elements already introduced. And one concern I have is when you start introducing consumer identity on top of a HIPAA, on top of a FERPA, you start getting into this huge, it's just overwhelming. And so as much as we can be consistent, figuring out what's the appropriate avenue. I know when the Consumer Identity Theft Act was first law, part of it was overwhelming. Part of it was you're just lost because one of the provisions says that you have to have administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. And so you're going to have people who want you to tell them exactly what that means, and those who say, don't tell me what that means, I think I know what it is. So the balancing act of saying, being too prescriptive versus prescriptive, and whether that belongs into a law, a rule, a policy, or where that belongs, I think is something that this group needs to be conscious of how we form that, where it may go, and also that it doesn't conflict or it enhances other things that are already out there. That would be one of my.
And it sounds like getting access to that legislation beyond the schools legislation would be critical for us to bring forward.
Right, and a lot of that is more, it's not so much the technical safeguards, because technical is pretty straightforward on how you do these. It's the people in the process and the education and the awareness and the outreach, and that, that's not in law, that is more in practice. And so how that comes about, I think, is something I'd be interested in working towards.
Thank you. Any other members of the work group to get stuff on the table? Yes?
Yeah, so as a parent, I'm probably the least informed on all these things, but I read in the paper all the efforts to try and address student data privacy in other states. And I would be really interested in having a national expert, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, give a presentation and help define for all of us some of these terms, and then also their perspective of what's been happening in other states in terms of passing legislation and what's been good or not so good.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, thank you very much. And all of you should have my email or Angela's email. As things come up 5 minutes after you've left or a week from now, we're always open to further suggestions. The last agenda item that we'd like to take a little bit, and I think we've covered membership. It's been terrific, the additions. We may need a different room because I think we're going to be a bigger group and we're going to run out of chairs. And maybe that's actually better if it was a little bit of a different format. We'll think about that, but I really appreciate the members, especially the school level personnel. Timeline, work groups, and meeting schedule. I'm open to some suggestions, especially from those more acquainted with how this process needs to dovetail with the legislative process. Any thoughts about how frequently we need to meet? When would be a good, we need to meet in a month, 2 weeks? So.
We got a lot of work to do in a short amount of time.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
We have deadlines approaching, so I'm feeling a little behind the 8 ball a little bit, frankly. So I think very focused agendas, very quick turnaround, frankly, because we do have policy draft deadlines approaching.
21st?
Very quickly.
September 15th.
No, September 15th is interim days, but the draft deadlines, I think, are either the 18th or the 21st.
I think it's the 22nd.
22nd, 21st, yes.
Soon.
Very soon. So, but having said that, it is possible to put something that is essentially a placeholder in, and that's one of the things I wanted to get back to. Peter, you mentioned that there were two, you mentioned the 3 that you had listed here, but you didn't say, you said you had 2 more that you were.
I just heard in the discussion,
Okay.
I wonder if they're separate, the issue about nonprofit, the question about nonprofit.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's a separate one or not. I'm learning as the rest of us
Well,
are.
my point is that I don't have a problem putting in the placeholders for some things, but I would like to be a little bit more specific within the placeholders. So as Sherry was saying, this is important for us to have before the 22nd, so that I can put something to LC and at least have something that we can tweak it when they get back in late November or December with the information. But if we have something already, that helps a great deal.
One thing I'll just share is when I heard in a couple of comments on some issues, maybe it's law, some maybe it's policy, some maybe it's practice. And in my head, I saw a grid, which had some of these topics listed, crossed with what's the remedy or what level of the system. And that's something our office could turn around pretty quickly with some suggestions or blank, or maybe we could get some feedback from the group. Here's the grid. What do we need to add in terms of rows or columns? And are there obvious things that absolutely must be law? And are others, the law is already there, it's more about communication? Or the last thing we need is another law on that. What we need might be is some funding or some support for small districts or tools to help them. So that's one thing I can envision the OEIB team here right away trying to prepare a very drafty version for the group to look at that I think then would inform in terms of draft placeholders. Well, which of these look like legislative and which don't at all?
Well, I like that, and in fact, excuse me, I like that. I think what we can do is, I would like to see, for the next meeting, I'd like to see some presentation from Ben on ODE,
and the HEP.
And I'd like to see that matrix that you just put together. From that, if we can do that clearly before the interim days or before the deadline for LC, then I can put something together as a placeholder that speaks to those particular issues and where there's a law that's needed and where there's not. So if we can do something like that, that would be, I think, specific. Is that, what do you think, Representative Springer? Does that work?
Absolutely.
Those are two issues, and I think if we just focus on those two issues, I think we get something done right away, and we need to get something done right away.
So given that, I think our staff can turn that around. Laura, did you have an additional? I'm sorry, Chuck.
I guess also, just following up on Representative Frederick's comment, using ODE, I'd really like to understand the breadth of the state board's rulemaking authority in this area. I've become real reluctant about statutory solutions, where you're going in trying to solve these real specific problems using statutory language, and whether or not there is the opportunity or already exists. I would just suspect it exists in law now that they can get there from here if instructed to go. Do you know what I mean? It makes me a little nervous trying this stuff in the legislature is all. So I really hope we look at administrative rule possibilities. It's really the preferred avenue from our perspective, just because it can be more specific and more technical in that area. I think
maybe more nimble.
It's more nimble. I think it's just better. Statutory is big. Seems to me like hitting it with a hammer. And I think you can get a lot more surgical in your resolutions of some of this stuff through the board. But I'm not sure what their authority looks like. But
Laura?
Is there a way for the next meeting to include Betsy's suggestion about the Electronic Privacy Information Center guidance as well? I mean, is there some sort of short advisory they could provide us, perhaps?
I wrote that down to research that. I think clearly many folks have said we need more instruction on definitions and clarity around that. And if we could get the best presenter, that would be phenomenal. I don't know if there's consensus about the best presenter, but I'm certainly, I mean, obviously ODE, it's a clear, needs to give us some stuff, and I did write that down, and I think that would be good and informative.
People keep saying there's this framework for other states that have gone down this road, and if we could, and I'm sure that they would know that as a national group, what the pitfalls might be.
And we did, Cheng Fei did, and we have it here. We didn't want to yet bring it in front of the committee, but there are state exemplars out there already. And our thinking was, and maybe it's bad thinking, let's not lead off with that. Let's get our own stuff unearthed a little bit before we go to what's been done before. But we're prepared as background information, or maybe with with some analysis, what's out there already, when were they passed, what's some context around it. We could even go further and maybe interview the folks in those states. Probably if you were to call Oklahoma as one that was mentioned, you could ask 8 people in Oklahoma who know about it, and they might give 8 different perspectives. But we'll certainly do more research. And I want to make sure everybody's aware, it's the first paragraph in the report, but federal legislation has been introduced, and I haven't seen a word of what it says, but Senators Markley and Hatch at the federal level, to some degree, are possibly addressing these same issues. And whether that goes through or not, whether it's exactly what we're talking about or not, obviously that's going to be pretty critical. And my guess is that our Oregon delegation wouldn't mind hearing if we come to some conclusions about what this work group has to say, but also we have to be mindful about that action, and is there testimony going on in Washington about that? So.
Peter, just so that you know, the Oregon delegation, some of the members of the Oregon delegation have already spoken with them. They are interested in what we're doing.
Okay.
That's the best way that they can put it. They're following us, and they want to find out what we decide to come up with. I would encourage. I think we have electronic privacy folks who are in Portland, in Oregon, that we could rely on to get information. But I frankly think that the first 2 things, that if we only concentrate on 2 things in the next meeting, that would be very helpful.
And reiterate those 2 things.
One is what kind of data are we talking about from the Department of Education? And then the matrix that might be created to determine which things might actually then go into a potential placeholder bill of some form if we need to have something like that. Because I think we need to come back and get more responses and get people talking about some of these things, but let's have something. We're under a time crunch. We can get some things done right away, then we can come back together to go over them and perhaps get more detail.
And I want to be clear vis-a-vis what Chuck said. One of the columns would be state board or administrative rule.
I do everything you can
Right.
to avoid legislation.
Yeah. I understand.
It's so unpredictable. Here we are in a task force out of your bill. So, I mean, you can see how this stuff gets lost in the process. I really think if we want to fix this, we go to the quickest source. You just cut through this just delays it for 1.5 years, really, if we go legislatively. So I'm just asking you to.
Let me put it this way. I have two different paths that I'm working on. If we can get some things done that are easily, I was on the state board. I remember trying to get some things. Sometimes that can be more delayed than legislative.
So that's a debatable.
I've seen it, believe me. But there are other things that I think the state board and administrative rules can do, and we just need to have a sense of what those things are. What do we want them to do? We don't have that as clearly as I'd like to put it. A matrix would be very helpful, and I prefer not to have to go through a whole legislative process, quite frankly, myself. But we'll see what's available, and we've got examples of what has taken place in other states. And there are some federal guidelines, but I think it'd be better if we can get through something at the state level, or even frankly lower, if we can start to see folks in Beaverton and other folks actually handling things. I mean, the problem that I have is I remember the lack of security issues with the Portland Public Schools, and having to say to one of the staff members, no, we will not publish these social security numbers of teachers and students in the board manual every week, which is what we were doing for a while.
I hope that was a few years back.
That was a few years back, but it wasn't that far back. It was one of those things when I said it, I was told, well, we've been doing that all along for a long time. Well, what do you mean? Why can't we? That's the best way to identify them. Yeah. And then when I said it, even when I said it 2 weeks later, they still published them. So I had to pull that as well. That's something that we still need to work on.
I just worry about the level of urgency I heard in some of these issues, and if there is any urgency around any of this, we can't go down. I don't think we can go down the legislative road and really solve it unless that's the only way out.
Okay, well, the challenge obviously will be to keep us to 2 agenda items, or a couple, obviously, public comment. We'll be using an electronic poll to put together the next meeting after I just check in with the representatives about the best time, or Angela and I will. And I just want to conclude by seeing if there's anything that the work group wants to suggest right now in terms of change to the format, or anything about the meeting that you really want to get out that needs to be different.
8:30.
Or 9.
Okay. All right, so start later. That's helpful.
Slightly later.
Okay. Again, please email with any other comments, and I'll reiterate what we started with, which was thank you. Thank you to all of you for this, a huge issue. And when we get back together, we'll continue.
And thanks for getting the coffee. I think everybody needed that this week.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, please leave your books behind.